stand-up comedy was not sort of considered an art form serious enough to sort of focus on itself. It was TV. It was partly TV. It was partly theater. But there were no stand-up comedy critics around. And no one, I think, was really looking at it in a serious historical perspective. And so suddenly it just struck me as that there was a need for a book like that, and to celebrate these guys who I thought were so important, who had such an impact on me, and I think on the whole culture.
Dystopia tonight. Dystopia tonight.
Hey. What's going on, sir?
Everything's good.
Awesome.
Great to be with you.
Great to hear. You know what I love? One of the things I liked about this book too is, again, I said I was a fan of the timeline stuff because I like it's hard to kind of, take a moment in time and go, this is how it happened in the order that it happened. Even when you're talking to people, even when I've talked to the comedians who were there at that time, sometimes their memory's a little foggy. They're not journalists, so they're not really like documenting things, and they're just like, oh man. But what I loved about this was, I always had an inkling of how influential comedians were to, the zeitgeist, like because, I would hear people say something funny, or somebody else said something, like a friend said something, and I'd be like, man, I feel like, as a comedy fan, I'm like, I feel like I've heard that before and somewhere. And then as I started getting into the business too, you kind of realize people are connected, who's working with Fallon's show that used to work on Jon Stewart, whatever. Like it's a very like big web of a world kind of thing. And you point that out in this book beautifully.
Yeah.
How did you was that something you knew going in?
Yeah. I mean, I kind of always was a fan of stand-up comedy growing up, from the old early George Carlin days through, Bill Cosby, Robert Klein, everybody. But I saw them as a generation, particularly the group that began kind of with Carlin and Pryor,
right?
In the years after Lenny Bruce died. That I saw that was the real sort of golden age of stand-up, and no one had really put it all together in a history, in a chronological way. It just, as you say, who influenced who came next, the different strands, the comedy club boom of the 70s, the kind of anti-comedy strain of sort of Steve Martin, Albert Brooks, the club guys like Robert Klein and Robin Williams. And anyway, I just saw them all connected because they were all coming up around the same time, the same generation. And I just wanted to do a history. And that I consider myself sort of a cultural historian. So.
And you lived through it, like at the time too, which is cool because you really were like the guy who went to these clubs and saw these guys perform, and
So, I was first of all, when I was a kid, I would listen to them. I was buying records and listening to country records, and then I moved to New York, and in the 70s, I was going to the Improv and Catch a Rising Star. I remember, the Improv. The day I saw for the first time Richard Lewis and Andy Kaufman on the same bill, but both guys I'd never heard of before, and it was just amazing the kind of talent you could see on just an average night in those days.
Yeah. And that was when you were documenting it, like, were you like, this is going to be a book one day, or were you just like, this is too exciting, do you have that kind of foresight?
Yeah, no, I probably didn't think that this is going to be a book someday. I was just living it. Then I became a journalist. I worked, I was a writer for Time magazine for many years. And I didn't really think I wanted to do a book because I was kind of addicted to the sort of weekly, week in, week out journalism and covering. I was the television critic for Time. I did other things, a lot of other for Time. And I never wanted to sort of stop and do a book. But what occurred to me is, that no one was really at the time, and we're talking 10 or 15 years ago, there weren't people covering stand-up comedy. Stand-up comedy was not sort of considered an art form serious enough to sort of focus on itself. It was TV, it was partly TV, it was partly theater, but there were no stand-up comedy critics around. And no one, I think, was really looking at it in a serious historical perspective. And so suddenly it just struck me as that there was a need for a book like that, and to celebrate these guys who I thought were so important, who had such an impact on me, and I think on the whole culture.
Yeah. We have a lot. I mean, people have a weird relationship with journalists, you know, and I don't know if that's just a perception today. You know what I mean? Like comedy wise, like there's always like, it's very clickbaity. You know how it is. Like people are always looking for an angle, whether to say somebody slams somebody else or looking for the controversy. Did comedians, when you went to write about them, how were they responding to you back then?
Oh, very, very well.
Cool.
Almost virtually everybody talked to me. Carlin was still around in a great interview and very, very gracious, and sat for a long time with me.
He seemed to be very approachable and very, we had Kelly Carlin on, and she's amazing. And I'm sure you know her too. But he always seemed, I've never met him. I wish I had, but like, he seemed very friendly even towards comedians, which I feel like, you know, the comedians that are around today usually are like, don't look him in the eye. You know, if he does come into a guest spot, don't say hello. And you're like, fuck, all right, I guess I'll just.
So, and virtually everyone I went to, Pryor, unfortunately, he was still alive, but he was, you know, not in very good shape. So I did not get to talk to him, but virtually everybody else. Steve Martin was probably the toughest. Steve Martin doesn't like to do interviews.
Right.
I finally got him on the phone for a little while, but you know, that was about it. Everybody else, though, Robin Williams sat with me for a long time. Robert Klein, Albert Brooks, one of my favorites, was great, and Seinfeld, you know, and plus, of course, lots of lesser comedians or comedians who were just part of the crowd.
Right.
Some of them very good. The club owners, some of the managers. I talked to probably around 100 people for that book.
Awesome.
Wow. Yeah. Who was your favorite out of the non-big names that you've came across? Do you remember any that like really grabbed you?
Of the non-big names, I don't know. I considered Albert Brooks not a big name at the time I did it. You know, he was sort of a cult, had a cult following. You know, there was a guy, I'll tell you one guy who kind of never had much of a career, but I remember seeing him at the Improv, and how impressed I was. It was a guy, Ed Bluestone.
Oh yeah.
He was a very clever guy. He didn't quite, you know, make it big, but there were guys like that. You know, that's the first one that comes to mind.
Yeah. The Albert Brooks stuff was he, I feel like it was him, Gilbert Gottfried, and I'm sure and I'm blanking on names, but they were very much like the ones comedians would always talk about too, right? Like, because Albert was on the Tonight Show a lot, and I feel like people would always be like, I never missed it when he was on.
Right.
But they were kind of like comics, right? He
had a series of bits, you know, that were sort of like bad show business, you know,
right?
Terrible ventriloquist, the bad mime,
right?
You know, and it was a concept, you know. He was making fun of show business. He was, and you know, some people didn't get him, and the ones who did loved him. Plus, I always heard from people and experienced it when I was with him that the guy was just brilliant. I mean, he was just so funny, just naturally. People, you know, his childhood friends, Rob Reiner, and you know, would all talk about just how Albert would crack them up whenever he was just at a party at their house or whatever. So, you know, guys like that who are just naturally funny are, you know, pretty impressive. Not all the comedians, you know, that I interviewed, you know, are that funny in person just doing an interview. I mean, they don't do. Robin Williams, you know, very serious guy with me. I mean, very, you know, serious about his comedy, low key. With other interviewers, I mean, he might perform. There was
Sure.
Robin, the performer, and there was Robin, the artist who wanted to talk about his art, and I got the latter, so that was good.
I actually love that. Yeah, that's actually because it's you can see Robin the performer anytime somebody with a camera interviews him. You know what I mean? So you don't really get that. But that's another thing I really liked about the book, because I feel like I actually got to hear him, say what he thinks about his comedy, what he thought about other people's comedy, and in a kind of an unfiltered way.
Yeah.
Does anybody you had a problem with?
Well, the one person there was one, I think, major comedian who wouldn't talk to me, and it was Elaine Boozler. Which was really bothered me, because she was the one in an era when women were not doing particularly well, were not getting much of a break in the clubs. It was still very male oriented. She was the one who sort of broke through, and she was the most important female comic of that generation. And I definitely, thought she was important to talk to, but she was very prickly. Didn't want to sort of give away her story to somebody else. Maybe she had in mind doing her own memoir.
No, she hasn't.
Whatever. But
funny you should say that, because Elaine Boozler was one of the people that we had reached out to when I first started doing the show, because I was just interviewing friends and comedians and people that I had met and just really admired, and I never met her, but I same thought process you had. She broke through. She's this amazing comic, and she lived with Leno and Robin Williams and all those, they all came up together. And her manager, who was her husband, obviously, obviously everybody knows who he is, got on the phone with me, because I think my manager had tried to reach out, and then it didn't work. So I was like, I really, everybody else from her generation has kind of done the show. I want to talk to her. So I'm like, let me give it a personal touch. I'll give it a call. And then he picks up, and he's annoyed with me immediately that I've even bothered. I'm like, but the funny thing is Elaine and I talk online. So like on Insta, not scandalously, but you know what I mean? Like, actually, she and I send photos. But like on Instagram or whatever, and she's very friendly. Come to my house in Italy friendly. So I'm totally confused by this whole thing. And then he's like, well, let me in the very beginning when we had just started, he's like, well, how many views you got? And we had decent views then, right? For something that was just starting. And he goes, let me know when you get to over 100,000, then we'll talk. And I'm like, I don't have when the hell is that going to be? And it was really weird. And I just thought he pulled an arbitrary number out of his head that he thought I'd never hit.
Yeah.
So such a bummer though. Were you disappointed? Did you talk to other people? Like, can you talk to Elaine or?
I think I did. I remember though, she was a problem to a lot of people. I remember Caroline Hirsch of Caroline's Comedy Club telling me how difficult Elaine was to work with. And, she had a temperament. And so who knows what goes on. Look, people have the right not to talk.
Oh, yeah.
I don't want to, say anything bad about her, because I think I said nice things in the book about her. I just think I think she was short-sighted, and if she's concerned about her legacy and her role in that era, she should want to talk, and she would have had an even bigger place in the book.
I agree. It is hard. I wonder if it's hard to pick projects and to know who to talk to and stuff like that, because this is such a phenomenal book, and I like everybody that contributed to it. And then there's always that one thing where I've had other books too, where you're like, man, how come they didn't get so-and-so to talk? You know what I mean? They mentioned, like, I'll see somebody mentioned all over in this book, and I'm like, I'm always left wondering, like, why the hell didn't they talk to this person?
Yeah. You can disguise, you sort of cover it up. I've in other books of mine too. Sometimes you don't get to someone important, but you sort of, you work your way through it, and maybe you pick up a quote or two that the person said somewhere else, which is fair game.
Right.
But you do what you can. You go with what you can. I was just very lucky in this book that everybody else talked to me, even people I'd sort of given up on, like David Letterman.
Oh, wow.
Was at a point in his show was rolling along, and he was not doing interviews. Although I had interviewed him for Time, I had done the Time cover story on David Letterman, so he knew me. But still, he wasn't going to talk for this book. He didn't. I just hit a brick wall. And I remember trying one last time, and I think I did work through. I can't remember now. I sort of knew his Robert Morton, who was the producer back then.
Yeah.
And but I can't remember how, but somehow I suddenly get a call. Dave will do the interview.
Wow.
So and he was great too. Also, a very, very funny guy in person. I mean, he's a guy who thinks funny, talks funny. Just you're talking to him and you're laughing all the time.
It comes through in the book too, because the first time I'd heard him talk about Robin Williams in a way when he'd come back in. And I think I remember this from the book too, where he basically said he made everyone check their wallets, which I thought was such a genius way to put it.
Kind of images he has. Yeah. Very creative guy. Letterman's really terrific.
Yeah. Do you ever find that this is probably like a weird analogy in a way, but like even when we're trying to get guests on this one too, like you try 1 month and then like you're like, oh, they're in like a bad mood, or no, you can't get a hold of them, whatever. And then you try again and they're a totally like sweet as pie. Sure. People get back to you instantly. I always feel like it reminds me of when I was a kid and I'd ask my parents if I could do something that clearly they said no for. And then you're like, I got to give it like 3 weeks, let it gestate, get them in a good mood.
Yeah, well, you learn to do that. You try different avenues. You try, you don't give up. You just keep trying. And you hope. Also, I think just the persistence. If you just make one attempt and then that's it. If you try over and over again, the person knows you're really serious. You really want to talk. Also, maybe he's heard that other people have talked to me. And, it also, gets the ball rolling when a lot of times they'll ask you who else has talked to you. And when the more people you can tell them, I've gotten to Carlin and et cetera, then, they become more interested and they don't want to be left out.
Right.
So, there's a tipping point, right? Like there's a point where once you get enough of them on, we did this very long charity special. And in the beginning, everybody be placing phone calls to comedians and saying, hey, would you want to jump on this charity special? And they're like, oh, I'll see what I could do. And we were just like, listen, if you can't give us a time slot, we can't do it. Then we got like 300 with a bunch of big names. And then people like, hey, how come you didn't call me? How come I didn't get another shot at it?
Sure.
Which is so crazy.
No, it's really gratifying that I look back on that book and I see, boy, everybody who is still alive, basically, I got to. And and if I'd done the book a couple of years later, Carlin would have been gone, or and
Robin.
So I Robin a few years after that, and so I did the book at the right time, and it's there, between two covers, and it'll be there forever. So people, it's really nice to have it.
When you were putting this together, how much of it was like based on what you had remembered, and how much of it did you rely on maybe notes from back then, or the interview part? Like,
no, I never took notes back in those days. It was just my memories, and that didn't play. That sort of laid the groundwork for it. But I had to do, everything. Lots of new reporting. I had to go back and listen to all the records from that I had. And get new ones that I hadn't, and hear, and hear about a lot of comedians that I didn't know much about. Earlier, So, I did a lot of research.
Yeah. And that's like, so, but you were, I may be wrong about this because I don't know, but were you around when the strike happened? Like you were on the field basically talking to people when that was going on?
No, I was in New York at that time. Or wait a minute, that was 79. I might have been in Atlanta. Actually, for a few years, I was at the Atlanta Constitution, Atlanta. But no, I was not. Did not witness that whole thing. So like that whole business with the strike and Mitzi Shore, the whole Comedy Store scene. I really was not part of that. I don't think I had ever been to the Comedy Store until while doing the book. I went, times just to see what the scene was like. But back in the day, no, I never saw Robin Williams at the Comedy Store or anything like that.
Okay. Because even when you write about the strike, it kind of, you do it in a way where it's I envisioned you there almost.
Yeah,
But that's just a testament to your writing.
Very hard. That's the goal.
Yeah. I was gonna say because it fooled me because I was like, wow, this guy was on the because especially when you combine the comments and the interviews and stuff like that with people that are there, it really does give you that like feeling like you are you, kind of witnessing everything happening at the time. Because there's a lot of people that even come on that remember it. It's funny. I quote this book a lot when I'm talking to those guys who were around at the time, and I'm like, did this, that big thing with Leno and him possibly getting hit by the car? Everybody's got a different story about that.
Yeah.
And it's so crazy because theirs always seems genuine to them. I mean, it is genuine to them, but everybody's got a different memory of whether that was true or whether that actually happened and whether it actually ended it.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny and hard to nail down.
And plus comedians love to tell stories and embellish stories and make them into, funny stories. So it is hard to know, and you have to triangulate a lot and get different points of view. And then you kind of figure out what you decide what you think the
right
story is.
Well, that's what I was going to ask next is how basically when you were getting all those stories and stuff like that down, how hard was it for you to kind of center it, you know what I mean, and be like, wow, there's a lot of different takes on this one.
Yeah, I don't know. That's what you do as a journalist, when you're doing a profile of somebody or a piece on a controversy in the industry. You just talk to a lot of people until you feel like, okay, I understand all sides of it. And then your job is to tell the story, the way you think it happened. And you're never 100% sure, but, you do your best. So the strike, I could see all sides of it. I mean, I remember Gary Shandling was one of the guys who crossed
the line. Yeah.
He had his point of view on it. And I feel like I can listen to everybody and digest it all and, tell this story as truthfully as I can.
When you were talking to people who maybe not necessarily got along that well, did you read, like if you had talked to somebody before Shandling, let's say, because I know there's some people that wouldn't talk to Shandling to that day, basically, right?
Yeah.
Did you wind up like poking the bear a little bit and kind of being like, well, so-and-so says to get something out of them, or?
I don't remember. I remember Shandling definitely was aware that he was not a popular figure at that time. And so he definitely, engaged with that, and I brought it up. I remember Letterman talking about him and Leno, but I didn't get a lot of really. I think enough years had gone by that whatever bitterness there was,
that's cool,
kind of faded, and they could talk about it fairly objectively. Anyway, Shandling was another interesting guy who sadly is not with us anymore.
I know, man. All the great, it's crazy how many of them are not around, and they were such and like even Saget. I feel like Saget went almost the same way Shandling did, where it was suddenly and no one expected it, and it's super, super sad.
Yeah.
Is there anybody that you didn't get to interview that you really besides? I mean, Lane, but I mean, like somebody that you would have been like, this person would have been.
Pryor would have been great. And I remember he was, he had his MS, and I talked to his wife, girlfriend, and tried real hard to sort of get a little time with him, but she was very protective and couldn't. Andy Kaufman.
Oh yeah.
Wonderful to talk to Andy Kaufman, but he was long gone.
I think they said he was going to appear at that Q meeting that they had. He was going to be one of the ones that returned.
Yeah, he was. There was a unique, figure in comedy history. He was fearless and I think kind of crazy, but some of that stuff is really amazing. But I remember at the comedy at the Improv in New York, and this would be the mid '70s, when they had there were a bunch of acts, and then I guess there was a break because I was in the line for the bathroom, and a guy barges in front of me talking in his little Eastern man, Eastern accent. He was in character, and I thought, who the fuck is this guy? And he barges into the restroom, and then 20 minutes later, I see him on stage, and it was Kaufman doing his foreign man bit. So, he was in character all the time.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Other than Andy, maybe who is somebody that you saw live that you thought just blew you away?
Well, I actually have the two best, funniest stand-up comedy performances in my life that I saw personally. One was Robert Klein at the bitter end.
Wow. When
Robert Klein was at his peak, there was no one who could just keep the laughs rolling. And he was so on. I just remember that night laughing. I remember some of the specific bits. Most of them are bits he did, over and over again. Some of them were I had heard for the first time there. He was just a great, great performer. Still is, actually.
Yeah.
And the other was in San Francisco. I guess this was earlier. Yeah. Because it was in the early 70s. I was in San Francisco at the boarding house. I saw Albert Brooks.
Wow.
And Albert Brooks, as a live performer, was just uncanny. The energy level was so high. He did bits. I mean, he did his famous rewriting the national anthem bit, if you know that bit.
Yeah.
And others that I never saw him do again. He was just great. Just those two evenings. So those were the funniest two single performances, I think.
Right. And two very different types of performers too.
Sure. Yeah. But what impressed me, it was Albert Brooks. I mean, he wasn't like this cerebral concept kind of comedian that you might expect. He was great on stage. I mean, he was with the audience. He was he just so high energy.
Right.
And, man, he was great.
So. I think I got this from your book as well, but Robert Klein, I always ask people, he was basically the godfather of this particular type of stand-up, right?
Yeah, I think people don't understand, because it was sort of subtle what he did. He came out of Second City. He was an improv guy who he could act as well as tell jokes. And so his routines were, a mix of characters and impressions and little scenes, and he would go in and out of characters. And that kind of free-flowing mix of jokes and acting and impressions and scenes is the style that I think really became the house style of the comedy clubs in the 70s. I mean, I think you see it in Leno, and you see it in Richard Lewis, and you see it in that was, whereas as opposed to, say, Carlin, who everybody loved and was influenced by, but Carlin was a very scripted kind of comedian. His bits were very worked out, and he didn't really improvise. Klein could really improvise, and just had a knack for, going for the punch, the right, laugh line, and throwing in a little quick impression here and there. And he would jump around from, current events. He's back in those days. He was doing Watergate.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Material and old TV shows, Our Gang comedies, and this and that. And that was the other thing. He was really representative of that baby boom generation. He was kind of mining all their childhood memories. Early TV, summer camp. Yeah. School teachers. So he really was somebody that they could identify with. Whereas Carlin was a little older, and he was a guy who was in the army, and he was in the he wasn't quite of that generation. He influenced that generation. But, so I think Klein was the guy who was really the most influential.
It's when you talk, because you could see it in a bunch of comedians from that generation too. But there's this special from the Improv, and I don't know if it's just called the Improv Special. I have no idea what it is. I have it on VHS, but you could kind of see that because it's Robert Klein, Richard Lewis, Billy Crystal, Robin Williams, Paul Rodriguez, and Robert's hosting it. And ever since I read your book and I watched that thing back, it's kind of funny because you can see Robert doing his material, and then a little bit of that in almost each and every person who's younger than him.
Yeah,
that's kind of doing it, which I imagine is why he hosted. So it's awesome to see that.
Yeah.
I was thinking about the 2 comedy albums I had at the time when sorry, my cat just jumped onto the desk as an idiot. The 2 comedy albums I had when I first had comedy albums in general were Seinfeld and Robin Williams. Those are the 2 I had, and they couldn't have been more different than the 2. Were there, groups of comics that you saw hanging out at the time that seemed to be like cliquish? Because the timeline thing that I was saying when you wrote about it at that time, it always feels like a team up to me. You know what I mean? Like Avengers style, like where you're like, oh my God, I had no idea that this crew hung out with these people, because you couldn't picture them together. But
well, at the time, I wasn't hanging out. I was in the audience, but you knew that there was, like, the Catch a Rising Star group was, Richard Belzer.
Sure.
And there was a group of comics that were there. I'm trying to think of, but and the improv group was a little different. They crossed over a lot. But then there was the comic strip gang, which was Seinfeld's club.
Right.
And that was, and Paul Reiser. And now I wasn't that, I don't remember ever seeing Seinfeld. He came along a little later. And it's interesting. I've never heard a Seinfeld album. So I'd be curious. But
I'll send it to you. I've got it downloaded. I'll just send it to you. It was it was called "I'm Telling You for the Last Time."
Okay, no, I didn't. I don't have it.
Oh, okay.
But I seems like I watched every bit of video of Jerry Seinfeld in existence. Anyway, so I know there was that group around that club, and then of course the LA group. Then there was the era when, in the mid 70s to late 70s is when, everybody moved from New York to LA. So the center of gravity sort of shifted out west. And then, Leno was originally a New York comic and he went to LA. Letterman went straight to LA.
Yeah.
Richard Lewis, New York guy, went to LA. Bud Friedman had his club in New York. He went to LA and opened. So it really, really shifted. Andy Kaufman, they all went out to LA. So, but that was, I was there and when I was going to the clubs, it was still New York based, and the LA clubs were just getting started.
Was there like a cool club, like, because that's a lot of comics talk about, like, maybe it's personal to them, but I feel like Catch was always a cool kind of place, but then the comic strip was like less than. Did you feel that as a journalist?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, you knew that Improv and Catch a Rising Star were the 2 clubs in New York. There was I liked the Improv better. I liked the kind of seediness of it.
Right.
The Catch had a little more showbizy, kind of slick showbizy kind of vibe to it. I think I found I liked more often. I liked the comedians at the Improv than at Catch a Rising Star sometimes. And Belzer was so dominated that club, and,
right?
And he could get a little wild. He could get a little bit much. I loved, Belzer was really. There was a guy who didn't want to talk to me at first.
Mm-hmm.
And then he did, and and then we became friendly. Belzer, he said to me, I thought you were just this nerdy, Time Magazine. I didn't want to talk to you, but he gained a lot of respect for me because how much I knew about it, and I took him seriously, and he took me seriously. So it was a nice relationship.
Yeah, that's a good combination.
Yep.
Your book. Also, and Steve Martin's, I don't know if you know this, and Rickles and Bob Newhart's overlap in some ways, in that sometimes the stories that people are telling in your book Steve then elaborate, like I've noticed that in Steve Martin's book, like he goes into like the relationship between he and Robert Klein and how it wasn't that great. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then in his book, it's even more so. And then in Rickles' book, which is crazy, he talks about the two of them coming to see somebody's baby in the back, because they all used to hang out like around in the backstage of the clothes and stuff like that. So it's weird to get these three different perceptions of the time. I don't even know if you knew that, but like it was because they all came out at different times, but it was kind of cool.
I remember Steve Martin's first book,
Born Standing Up.
Born Standing Up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I read that. That actually came out right when I was writing my book. So I definitely read it and may have used an anecdote or two from it.
Sure.
But and Rickles' book came later.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Rickles really wasn't part of my. But I do remember reading Rickles' book. I can't remember a story of his that overlapped with one of mine, but you may well be right.
It's just interesting because it's like for me, like again, the timeline thing is just like all of you kind of like put that era in perspective. When you were doing your book on Hope, because that's a different kind of comic. That's a different kind of comedy.
Sure.
Did you find any kind of? I always wonder what the older generation really thought of the younger generation and their style and stuff. Did you find any of that?
Well, you know what? Let me say first, the reason I did the book on Bob Hope was in doing Comedy at the Edge, I was always thinking, gosh, these guys were great, a great generation, but where did stand-up comedy start? And, how did it start? And I kept thinking, really, Bob Hope seemed to me like the kind of original stand-up comic in America. And he was a great figure in American show business, and no one had done a really good biography of him. So I wanted to do that. And but the other thing I wanted to say, the other thing that struck me is that when I would ask all these guys in Comedy at the Edge, all the comedians I talked to, I would always ask them who was your favorite comic growing up? Who'd you listen to? Who influenced you, etc. And they would say, everybody from maybe Groucho Marx to Lenny Bruce to, nobody mentioned Bob Hope. I mean, Bob Hope was so not, I remember Jerry Seinfeld saying to me, Bob Hope, I don't even consider him a comedian. He was an entertainer. He was an entertainer. So I think the younger generation had no interest in Bob Hope. And I just thought that was unjust. Because Bob Hope did basically create stand-up comedy in America. It was different. He did jokes that were written by other people for him. They were not personal at all. You never learned anything about Bob Hope from his jokes. I mean, whereas one of the innovations of the generation of Comedy at the Edge was comedy. Their stand-up was personal. It was they were telling about their lives and their girlfriends and their whatever. You learned about them,
right?
Bob Hope, it was totally never let you inside. He was an entertainer, but he was the rhythm of the jokes, the way he told, structured jokes, and the idea of doing topical jokes, which really nobody else was doing at the time, talking about current events. He created the Johnny Carson monologue, was basically Bob Hope monologue before Johnny came along. So anyway, all that is why I wanted to sort of resurrect his achievement, his career. What did they think of the younger generation? They were always, I think, nice to them. I think, Bob Hope was, but I'm sure there was a little competitiveness and feeling of, that the new generation had moved on. And certainly Bob Hope, particularly, as we all know, during the Vietnam years and the counterculture years, Bob Hope, was a Republican, and he was certainly the generation, the 60s generation, had no use for Bob Hope. And that damaged his reputation, terribly. So I think everybody's my generation sort of wrote off Bob Hope, but I wanted to sort of go back and remind them. But before before he became Mr. Republican, he was quite an innovator and influential and a great talent. I mean, just amazing.
Yeah.
It's funny the one you said about Seinfeld, because I never even realized he had said that. There's one clip of Bob Hope talking to a bunch of young comics, and I think it's from an early comedy, like one of those made for TV specials where they were kind of going over a thing, and Jerry kind of gets shot down by him because Jerry's got, they're like, does anybody have any questions for Bob? And Jerry raises his hand, and he's young and he's thin, and it must be like just in the beginning of his career, and he's like, yeah, do you think there's something to be said about comedians now coming up too fast when they're not ready? I feel like he had probably just turned down the Tonight Show when he said he wasn't ready yet. He's like, just shooting their shot before they're ready. And then Bob immediately goes, no, I don't think so. I've got a young comic open for me now, and this is Johnny Yoon. And he's like, and he's great, and he came up pretty fast. And you see Jerry just like, oh, okay. Yeah. And then that was it. And I kind of now wonder if that's why he was like,
that's a clip I have never seen, but I'm sure that Bob in those, he was old, and he really couldn't connect with young comics. He would always say nice things about them, and I think you're probably talking about one of those young comedian specials in the later years where they sort of brought on Bob as sort of doddering, Bob, of course, stayed around too long, and he was getting pretty feeble near the end there, and he couldn't hear, and he couldn't see very well, so who knows if he even heard the question.
And there's a lot to be said too for, like, I know he didn't write any of his own material or personal material, but there's something to be said for somebody who knows what material is good enough for them to deliver.
Absolutely.
Like, he knew what a joke was, he knew when it was well written and what he could deliver. So that's a comedic talent.
He had to pick them. He picked, he'd get his writers to give him a couple hundred jokes, and he would pick the 12 that would be in the monologue, and he had to know what would work.
Right.
And he would edit them. He would cut out all the extraneous words. He knew the rhythm that it had to take. And, I always compare it. Yes. Later, comedians wrote their own material, and their material was very expressive of themselves. And, I compare it to, the Beatles. After the Beatles, rock performers wrote their own material. You had to.
Right.
But Elvis didn't write his own material, and Frank Sinatra didn't write his own songs. And we consider them great, great performers and talents. So, there is something, an artist who just interprets other people's work, it can be a great artist as well.
Right. I always wondered, like, at that time, like even for Bob Hope looking at younger comics, Frank looking at other people who write their own music as that stuff was getting popular. I wonder if they ever thought, like, I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to try to do stand up this way, or I'm going to try to write this way. Or were they just like, no, I'm going to die on this horse? Like,
it's funny. Elvis had a couple of, his name was on a couple of songs as one of the writers, but he never wrote it. And I don't think he ever, he may have thought he could write something at one time, but you can be a great performer, and you know how to take a song and turn it into something, memorable. That's nothing to be sneered at.
Yeah. Did you know that a lot of the comics from that generation too loved Rodney? You know what I mean? Because he was so nice to them. But he also bought material from comedians, and I think sometimes what I'm mostly getting from them is like, sometimes we needed to pay rent, and he knew it. Even if it wasn't that good, he'd be like, "Here you go, kid."
Rodney, I never saw live. Robert Klein was like was really very close to him. But I don't know. I guess Rodney did write some of his own material, I think, but I don't really know a lot about Rodney, and he's an interesting figure, and I guess I did read his book, but not someone he's someone I need to do a little more research on.
There's one documentary I saw on him a long time ago, and I swear to God, this is like a Mandela effect thing, because I say it exists, and nobody else. They're like, you're out of your fucking mind, dude.
It rings a bell with me too. I'm trying to think.
Oh God, please remember what it was called.
Yeah.
Because it was a great one, and it really went into his younger life and like the jokes that like his attempt at stand up in the first place as his, his Jack, whatever his fucking real name
Jack
is.
Roy.
Thank
Jack
you.
Roy.
I couldn't think of his name. Like it's two names. And then, and Rodney and everything like that. But he did write his own material. And the cool part about the documentary was just how if you didn't really know him, you didn't know how personal that material was. But if you did know his past, like all those jokes hit just a little harder. Yeah. Because of, who his parents was, how his mother treated him, how his like all this stuff was very personal to him. And then, of course, he had, younger comics writing for him and stuff, too. It's very interesting. But I tell people there's a documentary and they're like, no, it's not.
I'll look for it. If I find it, I'll let you know.
No, thank you.
Somewhere.
Yeah. Did you? So when you were younger, did you always want to be a journalist? Like, how was was that something that you were interested in writing when you were a kid?
Yeah. When I was a kid, I didn't know what I wanted to do. It was just when I was in college and I started writing some theater reviews and stuff like that. And I just gravitated toward writing about the arts and entertainment. Never wanted to be a comedian. I thought you were going to ask that. I had no interest, never tried it, never wanted to try it, never thought I would be any good at it. So,
wow.
I just feel like I'm a writer, and but I do, feel like I've got a kind of sympathy with and connection with these guys. I think I have, I think I have a good sense of humor, and I think I kind of understand what comedians are trying to do, and a lot of them, some of them, I don't like, and some I like, but I know what I like. I'm confident in my tastes, and so I like to sort of write about what I like and argue for it.
Although a great book would be all the comedians that you don't like and why.
That would be too hard to get the interview. I'm doing a book on bad comedians.
Right. You know what's sick? The comedian would still love the attention for it. They'd be like, this guy wrote about me. This day and age, anyway. Yeah, that's a good, like, was there a type of comedy you prefer over another type?
Well, I always liked when Steve Martin and Albert Brooks were doing this kind of self
deprecating,
reflective, making fun of themselves. That kind of, the people who sort of look at themselves are basically making fun of the whole idea of being a comedian,
right.
Going out there and doing bad acts. I mean, that kind of conceptual comedy I always find funny. That's why I liked Andy Kaufman and some other guys, more recently too. I was also very into improv, Second City kind of stuff, I went to school for a couple of years in Chicago and went to Second City in the days, before the Dan Aykroyd, John Belushi era, but they were, whoever was there, those were great shows, those Second City. And the committee, when Howard Hesseman just died, I saw him in the committee in San Francisco when he was in the committee.
Wow.
Well before WKRP in Cincinnati. So I was very much into that era of improv, the Second City style. So
how far would you say, when you see somebody like him in his heyday, when he's not well known, he's doing that kind of stuff, and then they become who they are eventually, how far removed would you say they are from who they originally were on stage?
Well, you mean like Hesseman?
Yeah.
I mean, I totally recognized them. I mean, when the first time I saw, WKRP, I said, oh my God, the guy from the committee. And, I think he was very much the same. I have no memory of really any specific thing he did on stage in the committee. I think Peter Bonners was in that group too.
Wow.
who went on, from Newhart.
Yeah. He's great.
So it was really fun to see people like that. But even in the years when I was going to Second City, those couple of years, none of the people there got to be particularly big. But I remember them all as being great performers. J.J. Barry was a guy. I mean, Martin Harvey Friedberg. These are not names who
I was going to say I don't know.
Have careers really. But boy, in the context of a Second City show with 6 performers or 7 doing sketches, they were terrific. I mean, they just had a consistent quality level. It didn't matter if it was Robert Klein in the cast or John Belushi. Even the no names were terrific.
And so even when you were viewing like theater shows back in the day, you never had that feeling of like, I could get up there.
No.
Oh, wow.
I had terrible stage fright. And I couldn't even get up in front of a class and talk. And it was only in later years when I had to do interviews like this that I kind of was able to talk in front of cameras or, and I was very, very tough for me to do any kind of public speaking. And I would never, the idea of getting up on stage, I would just freeze, So never had the desire to do that.
If you were to do another comedy book, like Comedy at the Edge, but more modern, who would be the guys you would want to reach out to?
Well, I've been thinking what I have to say, what ought to be done is a book or at least a big article on what's happening today with what people call cancel culture, but with Chappelle and Kevin Hart and here, the way I put it is this was the generation that I wrote about that broke all the taboos and boy, you could say anything,
Right.
And yet now we're in an era where now there are sort of new sort of taboos, and stand-up comics have to be careful. And I'm not so sure that's a good thing.
I agree.
Who was it? Steve Harvey. Not that he's my favorite comedian, but he had a comment. He says, "I can't do a Netflix special. I would just offend too many."
Right.
I just wonder, and maybe you can tell me how much that's affecting comedians out there today. Is that inhibiting them? Are they, scratching out material? They say, I can't go there. I don't want to risk it.
I think when you're a bigger comic, like the weird thing is to me is what it's doing to comedians' psyches. Because when you think about Steve Harvey, I've seen his stand-up before. I like the guy, but he's not my favorite comic either by any means. But his material is not particularly, he's not a Chappelle or Bill Burr, and he's not pushing that edge. But the fact of the matter still stands is that guy now feels like even his kind of material, he's too worried about his own career and who might pinpoint him. I think he's safe, by the way. If I knew him personally, I'd be like, do the special.
Yeah, but he has a brand now. So now he's like a TV host.
That was a little, a little bit much to.
That's what I thought too. I was like, just do the special. Nobody's going to care.
But the fact that he would say that, and then we've got, I was just reading a piece about Kathy Griffin, and these comedians that you say one thing or one tweet or one wrong step and your career is stalled or even over maybe, and that's not a good thing.
It's such a cash grab though too, because a lot of the times, like, I mean, we had Pete Dominic on the charity event that we did. I called him and I asked him to be on it or whatever, which is hilarious because we get along for the most part. He had I don't know if you know Pete Dominic, but he had a serious show. He's a very liberal guy. But we started arguing about cancel culture, and he kind of got a little loud about it or whatever. But the funny thing is that we were talking about two different things. And I think when everybody talks about cancel culture, it's broken up into like 4 different increments, because there's the far left progressive who deem cancel culture, like who see cancel culture as, anybody who attacks it is attacking like Harvey or Bill Cosby going to jail. And I'm like, that's not cancel culture. That's just the criminal justice system. And they've, whatever. And then there's people who talk about cancel culture where they think if you're canceled, you have to go away. So when somebody doesn't go away right away, they go, cancel culture doesn't exist. And then I think there's the middle where cancel culture is creating a paper trail of somebody you don't like. So one of the examples I always think of is Joss Whedon. I don't know if you know what's been going on with him lately.
Yeah.
Okay. So Joss just did an interview for the first time in God knows how long. And I thought it was a great piece for the New York. Yeah. I thought it was great. I thought she handled it fairly. I thought he, however he felt about him, he came off pretty well. Right. And then there's a little piece that out of context, within contextually makes total sense. Out of context was he was talking about his childhood and how he was raised. And, he had a memory of him when he was 4 playing by a lake by himself. And there was the neighborhood family kid who was also 4. And he was like, waving him over to come and play. And then just like a kid would, he got bored and pieced out and left his friend there, or the family bonus. And he wound up, he didn't know he couldn't swim. And he wound up drowning.
Whoa.
Yeah. And so he's basically said later how like that wound up, like, he's like, I knew it wasn't my fault, but it still weighs on you. He goes, and then I realized, and that's when he was bringing it together with how he was raised, is his parents had never taught him how to swim either. So they let him by himself. And he was like, holy shit, I had no structure. So he says this. Mm-hmm. And then the people on Twitter who hate him. Yeah. This one guy tweets, who's got a popular account, goes, so basically Joss Whedon just admitted that he drowned a child. And then like states it just like that, and then glazes over and goes, and also says, tries to make us feel bad about how many women he fucked when he was married to his wife. And I thought, okay, that maybe didn't get a lot of play, but that's a paper trail. That's taken out of context. Yeah. To the point where one of my friends who actually knows Joss, or was like, oh my God, can you believe he said this? And I was like, but he didn't. Mm-hmm. And that's how it goes. So like what happens is now, if he does anything else that's fucked up, even though that tweet didn't land and get any traction, somebody could go, wait a minute, did you know this? And then that brings it in. Yeah. And that's what cancel culture is to me, is the relentlessness of misinformation against somebody that you don't particularly like. Right. That may not have really done anything wrong, but you don't like what they say. Right. And then it gets to be this presentation to a corporation that may represent them, that may want to go, I don't want to fucking deal with this shit. Yeah. So I'm going to take their thing away.
Yeah. Well, it's a really complicated and important subject. And I haven't seen a good piece on, I agree. I'm thinking about doing something on it. I don't know if it's the trouble trying to do a book is the subject is changing so fast. You can't keep up with it, but it's a time for a good big article on
agree.
And how it's impacting the stand-up comedy world.
Do you worry about that? That's a good, like, you're doing the article about it now.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I generally take this, I sympathize with the comedians, and I thought Chappelle's Netflix special was, not his best, but perfectly good. I mean, nothing wrong with it as far as I'm concerned. I mean, he's got a right to sort of, answer his critics and say, and I think he's pretty funny. Gosh, I just, there is the, I don't like to use the term, but the political correctness has gone a little, overboard. And I think like Chappelle making fun of, LGBTQ, how many letters there are. I mean, that it is kind of ludicrous, So, I can't keep up with the letters, and now we have a plus after it, and it's not, dissing the people themselves. It's the culture that has to sort of constantly, be changing its labels to keep up with. Anyway, so
no, I mean, it's
fair game for satire, and
absolutely, and that's the thing that's crazy to me, is like, I like being a comedian, being on the road and being in these clubs and stuff like that. It's funny that when you realize who cares and who doesn't care about that stuff, because the amount of like LGBTQ comedians I do know, and trans comics and all that stuff too, is just, they don't give a fuck for the most part. You know what I mean? Unless, they can get some press out of saying something pretty, you know what I mean? Like they're like, I'm dipping. Let me get some notoriety for this, or whatever. But like, they understand comedy about that stuff. And I think comedy is primarily inclusive. And anytime any group, no matter what it is, goes, you're not allowed to make fun of us.
Yeah.
That's going, I stand outside the group.
And just before I came here, I was watching South Park. I mean, those guys do stuff that, you couldn't get away with in a club. I mean, I haven't watched South Park for a while. I guess I was watching a couple shows from maybe last season.
Right.
But I didn't know they got a little black character in there now.
Oh, yeah.
And he was some of the stuff they were saying to him. I mean, you couldn't, if anybody was paying attention to South Park, these guys would be in trouble.
I know. That's the funny thing is that they used to be like, when they, when they first started, that everybody was a target at one point, you know what I mean? And like, they were back in the day when they first started. And I was trying to explain this to a friend the other day, just basically how, cancel culture started. They didn't call it that, but it did start with the right, you know what I mean? As far as, conservatives are concerned, because, they tried to blame rap music for violence and video games for violence. And they wanted to censor and cancel Tarantino movies. And then they didn't like the fucking Simpsons. So there was that group Moms for whatever I can't think of the name of it. It's not worth remembering, but it was whatever that they would write letters in every day because they didn't like Bart and they thought he was influencing their kids. That came from the right side of the aisle. And then for whatever reason, I don't know, liberals started doing it now. And then they've twisted it. What you just said before, where you were like, I don't even like saying political correctness. I feel the same way. I don't like calling it that because of what it now labels you when you address it, but you can't not bring that up to talk about it because it is insane.
Yeah. I just think you treat it all equally. I mean, there's excesses on both sides. And so comedians are, I think everything should be fair game, and everybody should just sort of, cool off a little.
Agreed. Do you think it's going to get back to it?
What?
Do you think it's going to ever get back to a point where we're basically where the pendulum's going to stop swinging and just kind of center on?
I don't know. Good question. I maybe. I mean, I think that.
I think you need to write that article and then it'll stop swinging.
Yeah,
That's what I think.
know.
That's what we're all waiting for.
I'm giving it some thought. Believe me.
Excellent. What do you think of the? I'm going to keep you for a few more minutes now. Okay. I promise I'll let you go. But what do you think of the Joe Rogan stuff? I don't know if you know him well, but basically,
I don't listen. I've never listened to his podcast, so I really don't. It sounds to me. You tell me. I'll ask you. But it sounds like he's just doing interviews that. Yeah, he's got some pretty wacky people maybe on there, and some people. You know, but it doesn't sound like he's not getting in trouble for telling jokes in bad taste.
No,
or jokes. He's just interviewing people that I'd say give the guy a break. I mean, it sounds like he's getting a raw deal here to me.
Well, it does sound like, yeah. I mean, I'm kind of in the middle of it because, again, there's multiple ways to talk about it, right? So when people argue about it, who are just his viewers and are like his diehard fan base, they kind of use the argument that's like, why can't people just have a conversation? And why can't people just talk about, whatever they want to talk about and yada, yada. And it's like, well, it depends. It depends on contextually what that is. So if you're Joe Rogan and you have 90 million listeners, like it's 11, his podcast is basically 11 million listeners every episode. And then he does 2 a week. And then by the end of the month, that's like 80, you know what I mean? Whatever it is like 80, basically 90 million viewers. It rounds out to a month listeners. That's wielding a bit of power, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like if you take that and multiply it by a, public health emergency pandemic situation, and you've got these doctors on, quote unquote doctors or whatever, right? They've got a PhD, they've got credentials, but they use those credentials to spread their point of view and misinformation.
Well,
yeah. So that's the thing that people are arguing over. But the craziest thing is that his viewers think it's about free speech because that's what Rogan has labeled it as. Mm-hmm. Why can't I hear these people out? Mm-hmm. But the problem is that he's not just hearing them out. He's letting them say what they want. He's not pushing back on it. Mm-hmm. He's not having people on that are the actual experts to kind of contest it or let their point of view get out. And he's also reiterating what these people have said because he happens to agree with them. So he's anti-vax.
Okay. If that's the case, I really am ignorant because I don't listen to him. Yeah. And I'm just reading about it. But I'm one of, I can't stand all the anti-vax misinformation out there. I think it's terrible. I think it's okay to bring on different points of view, but some of these,
Sure.
like, the doctor who's the surgeon, who DeSantis wants to be the Surgeon General in Florida, who doesn't believe in doesn't believe in vaccination. I mean, that's outrageous.
Absolutely.
Can a comedian do a show where he brings on, I don't know. I don't know. It
That's so
depends.
sad to
I
me.
have to hear it. If he's really supporting this and really consistently bringing on fringe doctors who are purveying sort of fringe theories that are debunked really by all the respectable, scientists. Whenever and I have some friends even in the family who are skeptical of vaccines and this and that, and but I just say, there are guys like Fauci and everybody who's working on this. These are people who spent their entire lives studying this. And I mean, if you can't depend on them, I mean, some doctor from who knows where comes up with some study. I mean, you don't think Fauci has seen hundreds of those studies?
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm a defender of the mainstream medical community in this, but I do don't want to come down too hard on a Joe Rogan yet before I see what he's doing.
No, I don't blame you. Yeah, absolutely. Check it out and check out those episodes and stuff and see what he's doing. Cause it is a hard thing to talk about, because I actually like his program. I like that, he does so many podcasts and talks for so many fucking hours. Of course, there's going to be people that find something they don't like in there, but I like long form conversations. I think it's cool to talk about DMT and aliens and all that other shit. And I like being introduced to people I've never heard of before. It's just, it's when you'll see when you watch, but it's when it crosses. There's not a lot of lines I care about crossing, but when it crosses a line into like people dying, I'm kind of like, guys, maybe we should pull back. So I have 3 more questions left, and then that's it. But basically, I want to thank you just for coming on, because it's been a blast, and I love getting a chance to meet you virtually.
Yeah. Great.
So first question, if you could go back in time and talk to your younger self, what piece of advice would you give yourself that would help you today?
Oh boy. I would say try not to obsess over your mistakes. You have to learn, I still to this day sort of, why did I do that? Why did I say that? You got to realize you're in this life to make mistakes, and you can't let them sort of, haunt you. So I think I'd say, live your life and don't obsess over things that you did wrong.
I love that. That's great advice. Next question is, what had to end in your life, good or bad, for you to wind up where you are today?
What had to end in my life? I started out, I went to school. I ended up at school in Berkeley, California, and I worked for a year in San Francisco. My first job was for a magazine called Saturday Review, that went bankrupt when I was after 6 months after I went to work for them. So it was a big blow, because that was a big job for me, a kid just out of college, to get. I was a copy editor on a big national magazine, was based in San Francisco, and then suddenly, poof, my job was gone. My big break. And so that I decided, because I had gotten a little taste of working in magazines, I decided that I would move to New York. And I was not a New Yorker. I didn't like the idea of moving. I loved California, still love California. But I moved to New York, and that's where my career began. So
wow. Nice.
So that magazine had to end for me to move on.
That's great. And signature question of the whole show. So if you were living in a real dystopia, and whatever it is, buildings burning, climate change, aliens, zombies, whatever, what would be your epic death? How do you want to go out?
Oh man. I'm always just curious what it would be like to jump out of a building. I don't know. I mean,
I was not expecting
what
that.
are you thinking about on the way down? And what is it like when you hit the ground? So if I really had to go, that would be something to experience.
All right, that's great.
That was a great answer.
Yeah, I was not expecting that. That was cool.
Don't make me live live up to that one. Anyway.
Well, what's great is that we ask each guest this, and we have the artist that does the drawings for the show draw. That's going to be the cover of the album. So
like the episode,
we'll see what she does. Yeah. Well, seriously, thank you so much. I love your book. I read it all the time. It's incredible.
Much.
And I hope you write that article, man. That's gonna be great.
All right.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks. This is a lot of fun. Thanks a lot.
I'm glad. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a good night. Bye.
Dystopia Tonight.